Welcome to episode 65 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
This week we are going back to the Mac, specifically back to the built-in security features in macOS. Maybe you know somebody who's getting a new Mac. Maybe it's their first Mac. Or maybe you just want to familiarize yourself or refamiliarize yourself or someone else with the security features built into your computer. That's what we're doing today. We'll be zipping quickly through a few features built into the Mac, security features specifically. These include Gatekeeper, System Integrity Protection, Xprotect, Sandboxing, Firewall, and Secure Kernel Extension Loading. Now, I saw John Cleese speak recently. Kind of want to go Black Knight on the first one and say, none shall pass. And of course, some shall pass. It's a gatekeeper, not a big giant wall. Tell us, though, please, what is Gatekeeper on the Mac?
Yeah, Gatekeeper is a technology that enforces code signing and verifies downloaded applications before allowing execution. By having this enforcement in place, it reduces the likelihood of executing malicious apps.
Hang on one second. Okay, so plain English then, Gatekeeper is basically something that checks something's credentials before it's allowed into your machine.
It's like a bouncer.
Okay. Oh, that's good too. I like that. It's the guy at the club. That's fine. Okay.
Now, when an app is signed, you normally don't see an alert when you open them, except when it's downloaded from the internet. These files will get quarantine flags, and you'll see a warning with details about the file and where it was downloaded from.
One thing to note is that alert will only appear if the app that you use to download the file supports quarantine flags. Safari is an app that definitely supports them, but some third-party apps do not support them. So if you download a file with one of those third-party apps and it's not properly setting a quarantine flag on the downloaded files, and you go to open the downloaded file later, you will not see that alert because the quarantine flag was never set in the first place. So that is something to keep in mind.
Now, is that specific to where it's downloaded to, or the app itself setting that flag?
It's the app itself setting that flag. It's basically a function of the way the file is created on the system, whether or not it has the flag switched on or not.
Okay, here's the problem though. We're talking about apps within apps within apps at this point. Because when you say is that, the app setting the quarantine flag, are you talking about the app used to download the other app, or are you talking about the app that was downloaded?
Yeah, it's whether or not the app doing the downloading supports setting quarantine flags.
Okay. All right, so then backing up. All right. So I've got a Mac, and I have now downloaded something that is going to allow me to download other apps. Has that thing that I downloaded to download other apps now built a hole in the wall that things can get through without being checked? I mean, have we found a way past the guy at the door?
If you're randomly launching those apps that it downloads, technically, there's generally a bit of an outcry when apps that aren't supporting that quarantine download flag are basically behaving like that, and there are people who will post and say, hey, just so you know, this app is kind of misbehaving, and most of them have been updated. I believe it was a lot of file sharing apps that weren't following the guidelines last I checked, but technically, yes. I mean, technically any app that you're downloading and running on your computer, depending on what it can do, could technically cause harm in one way or another. So it's not really worth kind of going down that rabbit hole of getting really paranoid about it, but it's just something to be aware of, that, third-party download apps or web browsers or whatever, just, there are ways to check and see if they support that. Even a quick Google search will usually help, but that is something just to be aware of.
So I feel like we might have actually skipped a step a minute ago. We talked about the gatekeeper, and Mr. Tacek, you referred to him as the bouncer. And that's great. Okay, so there's a bouncer and we got through, but we didn't actually talk about how we do that. Like, how did I get past the gatekeeper and then, or how did I get past the bouncer and then how long can I stay?
Basically, getting past the bouncer involves having a valid Apple developer certificate. So either being an app from the Mac App Store, all of those are automatically signed, or having a one of the third-party developer ID certificates, which is for outside the Mac App Store, but still signed with a developer certificate. So if you have a valid certificate, it's kind of like having a valid ID, you get in the club. If you don't have a valid ID, so if you are not signed at all and the computer is set to not run unsigned apps, or if you're signed with a certificate that's been revoked by Apple because you've been caught doing naughty things, you won't be allowed to run. You won't get in the club. And now Gatekeeper will periodically download a list of those basically banned or blocked or revoked developer certificates, and that's what it uses to cross-check against whether or not you're on the list to get in the club.
Yeah, so we were going through all the notes through Apple's documentation, checking when and ifs and all that, and Apple actually notes in there if an app with a revoked Gatekeeper certificate is already installed, it'll continue to run. It's not like Gatekeeper will step in and kick the guy out of the computer dance club.
What's happening there is that when, as part of its action, Gatekeeper is actually turning off that quarantine flag on the downloaded file. Once you pass the test and you get in the club, you get a stamp on your hand once you're approved. That's what happens. Gatekeeper, checks your ID, says, okay, you've got a valid certificate, stamps your hand, you're in the club. That quarantine flag on the downloaded file isn't there. So the next time you go back in the club, he doesn't bother checking because he knows you're good. So the issue there is that if you have a malicious app that later has its certificate revoked, that it could still be running on your computer if it's already been installed. Gatekeeper would only stop new installs of that. And Apple actually does have some other technology, which we'll get into later, that can help protect against situations like that.
Okay, because I was going to say, there are a couple of things I was thinking of, like, I know we're not talking about iOS today, but I've been involved with an app before. I helped design an app that was in the App Store, and then it wasn't in the App Store anymore. There was no, developer certificate as far as selling in the App Store or anything like that. But the app continued to run on my phone. Sadly, it doesn't anymore because it was 32-bit, and now Apple's all 64-bit. But my point is, once I had it running, it would continue to run even though it was no longer available.
Exactly.
Conversely, though, had I been part of an app that was actually going in and mining people's data or stealing people's data without their knowing or doing something nefarious, I assume that Apple would be able to turn that off. But what you're saying is that's not the Gatekeeper's problem. That's somebody else's problem that we'll get to in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the next thing on the on today's checklist: system integrity protection.
System integrity protection was technology introduced kind of recently. It was just in El Capitan, and it's designed to help prevent malicious software from altering protected files and folders on the Mac. So you're always going to have some files or folders that are more critical than others on a computer, and if you mess around with those, you can cause the computer to do bad stuff or cause lots of problems. So basically, system integrity protection restricts the root user account, the highest level account on the computer, the God account. It restricts that root user account and limits the actions that the root user can perform on the protected parts of macOS. So it almost makes root a little less powerful than it normally is. It almost means that there's a level above root, which normally isn't the case on Unix-based systems. So before system integrity protection, when you would type in your admin username and password for a certain piece of software, it would obtain root level access without any permission restrictions. It could basically do anything on the computer.
Mm-hmm. But now it can't. That almost makes it sound like I never have root level access to my Mac, which, for me personally, I'm fine with that because I don't need it. But is that so?
Yeah, on newer versions of macOS, that is so. There's a way to disable it from the recovery partition. You have to boot into recovery mode, disable the system integrity protection, log back in your computer, and sometimes it's necessary to get something installed and then you turn it back on. A lot of times sysadmins will have to do that if they have some custom piece of custom configuration, the way they have their Mac set up. But generally, for most users, you won't have to worry about it. There was a bit of concern before it was actually put into production that whether or not it would kind of mess things up for power users, and it really hasn't for the most part. So there are a number of directories and folders that come and apps that are pre-installed with macOS that are protected now with system integrity protection, and they can't be modified or altered by anything, even something running as root. it's a way to stop malware from taking over your computer without you knowing, basically, in some regards.
So everything you're saying, it makes it sound like, I mean, this is nothing that I as a user have to tweak or turn on or even worry about. It's just, it's set to go when I turn on my machine.
Exactly. As I said, there are a few cases where there have been some apps, or if you're like at a school or a larger business and you need a custom configuration for the way a Mac would be set up, that you might need to have it turned off temporarily, set up the Mac the way you need to, turn it back on. There are some developers that have been, it sounds bad, but generally it's been cases where the developers have been a little more lazy than others, where they haven't tried to figure out if they could get their program working a different way, where they've just told users, oh, go ahead and turn off SIP. It's causing problems. You don't need it, blah, 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 which is really bad advice. And it's just so their program works without them having to do any extra work. That's not something you want to do. You don't want to be turning it off permanently. You really want to have a good reason if you need to turn it off even temporarily. So definitely do your research before you even consider turning that off. Apple doesn't make it easy for a reason.
Up next on the checklist, XProtect. What is it and why do I care?
Well, it's Apple's built-in anti-malware protection for macOS. When you open an app downloaded from the internet, you'll see a message saying the app was downloaded from a specific destination. XProtect works a lot like Gatekeeper in this manner. You'll see this dialog from downloads in Safari, Chrome, Mail, Messages, or any internet app that uses the file quarantine aware technology. Now, the pros of XProtect, it's definitely a convenient way for Apple to blacklist individual pieces of malware that their tech team is running into issues at the Genius Bar. The cons, though, is it doesn't clean up existing infections and isn't like real AV software where it's always running in the background offering protection. The list is very limited.
It feels to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like third-party antivirus vendors tend to be quicker than Apple is on things like this.
Indeed, and they generally have a larger research team available to them who are constantly looking at the threats that are coming out, and they have a much larger user base reporting these threats as well.
It also seems to be kind of a threshold-based thing with Apple, that we're really only seeing them add a given piece of malware to XProtect if it either is affecting a large enough number of users where they're seeing that in their Genius Bar interactions with users or on their discussion boards, or if a piece of malware has hit the news in a big enough manner where it's, the sky is falling, Apple's going to be hacked by this super sneaky new malware, even if it's really not infecting that many people. It usually seems to be one of those two things before Apple will proactively, or I shouldn't say proactively, they'll go ahead and add to XProtect. They've proactively added a couple pieces of malware in the past before security researchers were aware of them, which was kind of interesting and different than past behavior. But that's not the norm. And then one thing to note here is that what Nick said about it not being able to clean up existing infections, well, that's true with XProtect. Apple has in the past, rather, they've got some built-in malware removal tools that they're not for every piece of malware, but for some of the bigger threats that have caused lots of problems in the past, like the flashback Trojan horse a number of years ago, Apple actually built a custom removal tool that would run, I believe, at startup on the computer, and it would clean up infections. And that was all done in the background. I think it would alert the user after it had detected the problem, but that is not for every piece of malware that XProtect can block. They don't have removal stuff for that. So there's a chance that if you get infected with something before Apple adds it to XProtect, that basically you could still be running that piece of adware or malware, and XProtect would not care because it's not looking at what's already on your computer. It's only looking at what you're trying to run from then on out.
Earlier, Mr. Rob has said something about it's going to pop up a message, if the download comes through. I think it was Chrome and Safari and Mail and a few other apps. Is there anything in particular that I should be looking for, that the average user should be looking for when those messages pop up, or is it just if a message pops up, then you need to pay attention to the fact that something is downloaded into your computer.
Generally, I think the messages these days will say something along the lines of, and this is particular to XProtect. The message will say something like, "This file was downloaded from Safari at whatever date. This file could harm your computer." And I think they might have a click here for more information. It goes to a general page on their website. Gatekeeper messages are a little bit different in that a lot of times if the certificate has been revoked or there's a problem with it, that it just says something simple like, "This app is damaged, go to the developer's website and download a new one." And that's for cases where the developer would revoke their own certificate, or they'd need to create a new one for whatever reason. It wasn't necessarily that it was malware. It could be that a development laptop was stolen and they revoked their certificate proactively so nobody could use it for bad things. So in that case, Apple's basically trying to say, "Hey, this is a problem, but it might not be a big problem. Go see if there's a newer version of the app that solves the problem." So the messages are a little bit different between the two, and they're pretty informative as far as what's going on.
So earlier, we went to the club. Now we're going to the playground. Talk to me about sandboxing.
Well, App Sandbox is an access control technology in macOS and iOS that's enforced at the kernel level. So really low level on the computer, basically designed to limit and contain damage that any one app could do to the system or user data if that app is malicious or becomes compromised.
See, I've always loved the name sandboxing because it's very illustrative. I want to make sure, though, that I'm getting the illustration correct. Kind of like a sandbox in the real world. You can kind of think of sandboxing as providing a safe space for developers and users to build or play. As long as that work stays in the sandbox, it's not going to get messed up by anything else, and nothing else is going to mess it up. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Basically, with sandboxing, your app can only touch your own app's files and data. So you can do stuff like create documents within your app or create data within your app, and your app can read that data and write that data disk, and it can go ahead and work with that stuff, but it can't go and start messing around with the data for a different app. Now, on iOS, that's true for all apps. Like any app on iOS, any developer app, cannot mess with the other stuff. There are ways that you can kind of like say, I have a group of applications and I'm the same developer and I want my apps to be able to communicate with each other. And there are ways to do that. But you couldn't have a situation where an app would be, messing with somebody else's app and intentionally, and there was no foreknowledge from the other app. I didn't want other stuff messing with it. That isn't supposed to be able to happen on iOS. On macOS, apps are, if you're distributing an app in the Mac App Store, you're supposed to be sandboxing it these days. You can still get, if you've got an app in the App Store and it's been there for a really long time, you can still request an exemption. Apple still grants that in some cases. But any new app that goes in the Mac App Store needs to be sandboxed. Apple recommends it for third-party apps, but doesn't enforce it at this time. So you technically could still make a developer ID app that could run on a Mac, and it doesn't have to be sandboxed. So it could mess with other files. Any app on the Mac that's not signed at all, if you're letting anything run on your computer, that can do anything it wants, essentially. Because iOS utilizes sandboxing across the board, that's one of the major reasons that we see a lot less damage from apps distributed on iOS. There's not widespread issues with adware or anything else like we see on the Mac because of the way iOS enforces sandboxing across the board.
Next up on today's list, the firewall, which I think I understand, but I'm glad to be part of this discussion now because while I think I get it, I'm not 100%.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about setting up your firewall on your Mac before.
It was a while ago, okay? Get off my back, man.
All right, so everybody should have their firewall set up, but assuming you're brand new to the show and you're looking to get your firewall set up, or maybe you just got a new computer and you're like, oh yeah, I still have to do it, or maybe you just haven't done it yet. That's not you, is it? That's
not me. No, I've just forgotten what it means. I mean, I know I did it. I just don't remember why anymore because it's been a while.
Well, the firewall allows you to limit the traffic to and from your computer.
The built-in macOS firewall is still only inbound, though.
Yeah, that's right. Once you add an app to your firewall advanced settings, you could specify whether or not you want it to allow connections or not.
Hang on a second. I'm sorry. What was your question, Mr. Chachek? It's only for an inbound? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a weird kind of question. Why would I or anyone want an outbound firewall? Because I assume that any information I'm sending out from my computer, I want to get out. Is there
anything that you're sending? But what if an app is sending stuff that you don't know about or didn't want to send?
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's a lot of reasons for outbound firewalls. Keeping an eye on an app to make sure it's behaving correctly, that it's not sending data, phoning home with data that you didn't expect it to. It's a good way to. I mean, outbound firewalls are kind of hard to configure in the first place because there are so many connections that are going out from your computer at any given time. Mm-hmm. But they're a good way to also know when something's trying to make a connection that maybe shouldn't be, because all of a sudden you see some piece of software you've never heard of trying to connect to some website you've never heard of. That's been a lot of ways that people get clued into a new piece of malware. And it's actually a reason why a lot of malware authors for the Mac will abort if they see that a Mac has an outbound firewall such as Little Snitch installed during the malware's install process when it's trying to get on your computer. If it sees stuff like Little Snitch, it goes, "Oh no, that's gonna figure me out way too early here. I'm just not even gonna install myself." And it's actually a pretty common trait we've seen with a lot of malware on macOS over the years.
I was just thinking, if I was the piece of malware, I'd be like, why don't we just try to disable that?
Little Snitch actually has that's happened in the past, but they've also got a very robust security system in place to ensure that their outbound firewall can't easily be disabled without the user really knowing about it.
And the whole cat and mouse game.
Uh-huh.
So what's interesting to me is you're talking about the fact that, yes, if I want information to go out, then I want it to go out, but other things in my computer might also be trying to send things out. It's not just a matter of, one of us in a way.
Yeah.
Same goes for the firewalls. I mean, yes, there's a firewall built into the Mac operating system, but I'm getting my internet service from someone that doesn't like happen when my Mac gets turned on. I mean, your ISPs are doing firewall stuff too, right?
Yeah, well, much of the hardware that you have from your internet service provider will have firewall settings as well. And it's good to get to know the hardware, but on the Mac level, it's good to configure it as well, especially if you have a laptop or you're traveling with your Mac and you're using different wireless networks. You want your computer to have its own settings configured as well. And just a refresher, under your system preferences, under security, then firewall, you'll see your settings from there. When you click the little lock icon and you authenticate, there's a couple of settings within here that you can enable, disable, add trusted software to allow connections. One of the settings is automatically allow signed software to receive incoming connections. So if you download the app from the Mac App Store or somebody or a piece of software that's using a signed certificate, you have that trust level to make it so you can have those connections happening without having to manually add it from within here. To note, apps included in OS X are signed by Apple and are allowed to receive incoming connections when that setting is enabled. Now, if you want to deny a signed application, you have to first add it to the list and then explicitly deny it.
One thing to note with regards to your ISP and your router firewall, that is definitely something you want enabled, because that is what is stopping the bad guys on the outside of your network from trying to attack all those devices that are on your network, all those IoT devices that so frequently have problems. Exactly. The firewall is basically stopping those incoming connections that you did not authorize. If you ever log into your router and you look at the firewall log, I guarantee you will see tons and tons and tons of connection attempts from all over the world every single day, every hour of every day, because there are people who are scanning the internet every hour of every day. Automated scripts, malware, hackers in their mom's basements. There are people out there who are always knocking on those doors, basically rattling the door handles, trying to see what's open, what they can get into. And the firewall is protecting your network from that, basic attempt at intrusion.
The last item on today's list is secure kernel extension loading. Now, before we get to secure kernel extension loading, what is a kernel extension and what is a secure kernel extension? Well, okay, a secure kernel extension is a kernel extension, but what's a kernel extension, please?
Okay, a kernel extension is technically a piece of data. Kind of think of it like the old extensions back in the OS 9, OS 8 days. It's usually when you have a piece of hardware that needs to interface with your Mac, or something that needs to access hardware at a really low level. So printers or scanners generally will need a kernel extension. Anytime a piece of software needs to do things a bit differently than normal, it would need a kernel extension. So one example would be what we were just talking about, outbound firewalls. The way something like Little Snitch works is it needs to reroute your outbound network traffic through itself, and then compares that traffic against its set of rules as to whether or not it should allow that connection. To do so is going kind of a different route than normal, the way network routing would work on a computer. So it needs a kernel extension in order to work correctly. So basically, secure kernel extension loading, which was introduced in High Sierra, is technology that requires the user's approval before it will load a new third-party kernel extension. And that is kind of, there's pros and cons to that. The pros is that it's stopping some of the nasty malware from getting onto your computer at a level that it can do a lot of damage across the board. I mean, the truth is that you don't really need to attack a computer at a root level or a kernel level to do damage. I mean, just attacking something at a user level and stealing all their data is usually damaging enough. But if you really want to own the entire computer, you're going in at that kernel level. So that secure kernel extension loading basically requires the user's approval and says, hey, this piece of software is trying to install this kernel extension. Do you want to allow it or not? An example of a bad kernel extension that you'd want to be blocking would be something like logtext. It is a keylogger that runs as a kernel extension, and it was open sourced a number of years ago and has thus appeared as the keylogger component in a number of pieces of malware since that time. So that's something that obviously you wouldn't want being installed on your machine without your knowledge. And secure kernel extension loading can help in a situation like that.
So is there different dialogue or warning message? I mean, it's the same username and password authentication window that we're used to seeing when we have to authenticate anything, right?
I believe so, yes. It does say that it's trying to install the kernel extension, and I want to say it's a timed thing too. Like, this app is trying to install this kernel extension. Do you want to allow it? I know it's caused problems for some anti-malware software actually that needs to have the kernel extension component running in the background, because it's essentially having to your users have to now make an additional step in installing your software that they might get confused by or not follow through with correctly, and then your software doesn't work. And so that's where some developers have kind of run into some headaches here. But the security benefits still should outweigh the problems and difficulties caused by it.
Here's what I love about the show notes for this show. Well, for this episode, but for, really all of our episodes, they give you a good place to point people. I mean, Apple, no offense, but, what is Apple going to say besides it's safe and it's secure? Unless you go into their, actual security pages, in which case it's not something that most people can understand. Here, with this show, with Secure Mac, with Nicholas and Nicholas, you have a third party, fans of Apple products, sure, but, here you have a third party saying what makes a Mac secure and why, and pretty easy to understand ways that people can check out on their own. Anyway, that's what we try to do with all of the show notes. And of course, the place to find them is securemac.com/checklist. Now, here's the thing. We all know people who, for whatever reason, haven't quite figured out the whole podcast thing, or maybe they just do better reading along, or maybe they do better having, something written to refer back to. So this info is always available at securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask us or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.